Good afternoon. Today we are going to begin with some moments of silence. We want to mourn for all those who have been struck by acts of warfare violence unleashed during the last week. We think of Paris, we think of Beirut, and we also think back to other attacks this year in Kenya, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. So many victims, so many places, on so many occasions, it begins to feel as if the world itself is at war. After this silence, though, we cannot be silent. We have decided to go on with our work and with our seminar. The best way to demonstrate our solidarity with those who are daily hit by acts of violence, aggression, and war is to keep on thinking and acting critically, questioning the circulation of power and the articulation of violence. Faced with these unconscionable recent events, Professor Rosin Vallon has decided that his place right now is in Paris, and he has decided to return there. We understand completely and support his decision, and we will honor his decision to be active by our own decision to continue on as well. At our seminar, we will not be trying to connect the reading of Foucault's abnormal lectures to the recent events. Foucault's work, like ours, goes sometimes at slower pace. Questions and analysis take time, and the emergency should not make us detour the urgent. We cannot allow that excess of speed to hamper the pace of thought. Critical thought needs attention. Neither silence nor forced speech are, by contrast, necessary. Foucault 1313 is a space of critical thought, pluralism, and engagement. This is why being silent today would feel like a defeat of all those principles that we hold dear, necessary, and unnegotiable. Welcome to Foucault 513. Today, we are addressing the 11 lectures given by Michel Foucault at the Collège de France from January to March 1975. There are several different moments of inflection in these lectures, but one of them, perhaps the most visible one, is that Foucault had completed his last book, Surveiller et Punir, which was published in February of that same year. Abnormal is not independent from Foucault's study of disciplinary power and the identification of the punitive society. Those big axes are inscribed in these lectures, and they also unleash a new research project, that of the history of sexuality. These two projects interconnect sometime in the middle of the month of February, perhaps on Wednesday, February 19th, when Foucault becomes again interested in confession, in the question of penance, in penality itself, but this time from the perspective of the confession of sexual practices. You have had the opportunity to read Bernard's introduction to the abnormal seminars, as well as Vina Das and Emmanuel Sadat's first takes on this course, the main challenges it represents, and the questions regarding power it raises. We have a short session, and I don't want to consume time from our discussion, but I would like to simply read a couple of fragments from these lectures. The first one comes at the end of the discussion about the grotesque and the ubuesque that Foucault, in a fantastic rhetorician, unwillingly begins to theorize. Then, at the end of the same lecture, he says in page 25, I would like to try to study this emergence of techniques of normalization and the powers linked to them by taking as a principle, as an initial hypothesis, that these techniques of normalization and the powers of normalization linked to them are not simply the effect of the combination of medical knowledge and judicial power, of their composition or the plugging of each into the other, but that a certain type of power, distinct from both medical and judicial power, has in fact colonized and forced back both medical knowledge and judicial power throughout modern society. It is a type of power that finally ends up in the courtroom, by finding support, of course, in judicial and medical institutions, but which in itself has its own rules and autonomy. What I would like to study is the emergence of the power of normalization, the way in which it has been formed, the way in which it has established itself without ever resting on a single institution, but by establishing interactions between different institutions, and the way in which it has extended its sovereignty in our society. Later, Foucault brings in his master's voice, Georges Canguilhem, that Emmanuel will study more in depth, in order to found a new idea on the key word of most of these lectures: what is normalization and what is a norm. As he says, this year Foucault is not interested in the dispositif, but rather in the effects of normalization of these dispositives. In page 15, in Canguilhem's text on the normal and the pathological, there is also the important idea that the norm is not at all defined as a natural law, but rather by the exacting and coercive role it can perform in the domains in which it is applied. The norm consequently lays claim to power. The norm is not simply and not even a principle of intelligibility. It is an element on the basis of which a certain exercise of power is founded and legitimized. Canguilhem calls it a polemical concept. Perhaps we could say it is a political concept. In any case, the norm brings with it a principle of both qualification and correction. The norm's function is not to exclude and reject. Rather, it is always linked to a positive technique of intervention and transformation, to a sort of normative project. It is on February 19th that Foucault declares, I want to begin the other part of my topic at this time, which is that the field of abnormality is very quickly taken up with the problem of sexuality. There, he begins a lecture that I find particularly fascinating about confession at two levels, la confession and l'aveu. Confession is part of the in-depth Christianization taking place between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and then onwards. What seems more important to me is that the analysis of confession is not only a canon law formation, but also a close dialogue between canon law constitutions and manuals and civil law, constitutions and manuals, and civil law as expressed in procedural legislation, a genealogy that probably begins in the 13th century. In these lectures, Foucault intends to trace the genealogy of a triptych of individuals that allow him to enter into the realm of the abnormal, the human monster that will end up being the object of teratology and embryology, the moral monster or l'individu à corriger and the institutions of rectification, and finally the masturbator and the appearance of the child's sexual body. But this is only a part of a longer project. Since 1970, Foucault says, the series of courses has focused on the slow formation of a knowledge and power of normalization based on traditional juridical procedures of punishment. The course for 1975-1976 will bring this cycle to an end with the study of the mechanisms with which, since the end of the 19th century, we sought to defend society. To address some of these main questions, we have with us Veena Das and Emmanuel Sadat, and Bernard Harcourt will respond, and then we will open the discussion to the public. Veena Das is Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at the Johns Hopkins University. She has also taught at the Delhi School of Economics for more than 30 years and also held a joint appointment at the New School for Social Research. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Academy of Scientists from developing countries. She has been awarded many different prizes, among others the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Anders Brexius Award of the Swedish Society of Anthropology and Geography. Veena Das' research covers a range of fields. She is passionately interested in the question of how ethnography generates concepts, how we might treat philosophical and literary traditions from India and other regions as generative of theoretical and practical understanding of the world, how to render the texture and contours of everyday life, and the way everyday and the event are joined together in the making of the normal and the critical. Her most recent books are Life and Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary, Affliction, Health, Disease, Poverty, and 3 co-edited volumes, The Ground Between, Anthropologists Engage Philosophy, Living and Dying in the Contemporary World, and Politics of the Urban Poor, that is forthcoming. Emmanuel Sadat, our colleague here, is a historian and a sociologist whose work engages in law, citizenship, and colonial empire. Professor Sadat is Associate Professor of French and History at Columbia University. She has taught at the Institute for French Studies at New York University and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Professor Sadat's first book, Les Enfants de la Colonie, Les Métis de l'Empire français entre suggestion et citoyenneté, was published in France in 2007 and won the Auguste Pavie Prize. It was translated in English as Empire's Children. The book examines the relationship between race, filiation, and citizenship in the French Empire. Her current book project analyzes the intersection of law and violence in the French Empire through the history of the Code de l'Indigénat, the French colonial penal code established in 1881. And Professor Sadat is currently a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. And finally, as I said, Bernard Harcourt will be responding and beginning the discussion. Bernard is our colleague and co-convener of this Foucault 1313, and his last book was recently presented at Book Culture, Exposed, Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, recently published Harvard University Press. So please help me, join me welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar, especially because it's a little intimidating to be somewhere where you've tried to put together people who spent their life studying Foucault and those who delved in Foucault occasionally. So bear with me for thinking more of the kind of questions that arise for me when I read Foucault, especially in relation to Canjulhan. And also, if I take some adjacent kinds of discourses which are happening not in France, but in India. So in Michel Serres's moving tribute to Foucault, as he comments on Histoire de la Folie, madness appears as the geometry of the incommunicable. Quote, very profoundly then, the lessons of this book take up those of Nietzsche, as well as Hellenic and medieval lessons. It is a discourse of unreason on reason, for which these stutterings of reason on madness prepare the way. Here we discover the inspiring chain that was loosed from the hands of Goya, Van Gogh, Chekhov, Artaud. But Foucault has already turned away from the fascination of madness to its more prosaic forms. By the time we come to Ignormal, we are dealing with mental illness and not madness, and by the end of the course on 19 March 1975, Foucault speaks of a new kind of composition of psychiatric knowledge, in which psychiatry no longer seeks to cure, or in its essence no longer seeks to cure. It can offer merely to protect society from being the victim of the definitive dangers represented by people in abnormal conditions. So how is this broad plot line filled as the psychiatrist is found not in the asylum, not even in the presence of the theater of the hysteric, but in courtrooms, in the deep countryside peering over evidence of sexual misconduct, and the bedroom of the masturbating child? What is the picture of power that psychiatry comes to embody as it gives up the dream of curability of the ill person and instead becomes the defender of the social order? Here is first a rather prosaic summary of the broad argument of the course. I should say that the broad arguments are often clearer. The very small hinges are where I think I get very stuck, and so I'm going to put both the small hinges before you and the broad argument, but I start with the broad argument. The main question posed in abnormal, seen from the perspective of the law, I realize that from another perspective, this may not be the main question, but there is a sense in which law is asking something of psychiatry, and that seems to me to be quite interesting. Might be this. What are the early foundations of modern notions of culpability and techniques of normalization which have organized public institutions? The first important movement in abnormal is to argue that juridical and psychiatric discourses come together between the late 1700s and early 1900s to constitute a modern system of correction and punishment. While in 18th century penal law, psychiatric testimony is adduced to establish soundness of mind, to establish responsibility in law, in modern law, psychiatric testimony shifts its focus from the crime committed, that is an actual crime, to the criminal and the conditions that could have led to the crime. This shift creates a space for expert knowledge provided by the psychiatrist, whose testimony creates a link between the criminal act and the life of the criminal. Minor events that occurred before the crime was committed and which are not illegal in themselves gather weight in the light of the crime, in which older notions of culpability and standards of proof do not work. By tracking the interchange and traffic between the categories of the monster, the person to be corrected, and the masturbating child, as these move between judicial categories and psychiatric ones, Foucault argues both for the invention of instinct in psychiatry and the regulation of sexuality through techniques of normalization that now create a split between the crime and criminal on the one hand and the disease and the ill person on the other. The text is fascinating for showing in what way modern reason creates a continuum between the prison and the asylum, within regimes of incarceration, at the institutional level, and creates a picture of power in which the precise economy of modern punishment also creates the space for moving what might have remained marginal discourse of criminal psychiatry to generate concepts that become central in mainstream psychiatry. The texts show that the claims by some that Foucault should have paid more attention to sovereign power are hard to entertain. But what we have here is a demonstration of the way sovereign power and the picture of power as normalization evolve together. Even within the disciplinary regimes, sovereign power does not simply disappear. It is reallocated, often degraded, sometimes silenced. And though it is not like a potential waiting on the doorstep of reality, it can sometimes be sensed in the most unlikely of places, such as in The Witches' Pact with the Devil, that Foucault argues takes the model of a juridical subject, unlike possession, as we shall see later. As he was to say later, I do not wish to say that the law fades into the background or the institution of justice tends to disappear, but that the law operates more and more as a norm. Judicial institutions are increasingly integrated into a continuum of apparatuses, medical, administrative, etc., whose functions are, for the most part, regulatory. So we already have over here sovereign power, we have regulatory power, we have normalizing power, and we have disciplinary techniques. As a counterpoint to the organization of public institutions, the family is the frame of reference for the individual to be corrected. Coincidentally does disappear very quickly from the text, and he himself acknowledges the fact that he has not been able to speak about the individual to be corrected. And this will become actually very important, I think, in the later works. The monster, who appears early in the text as the exceptional figure, cosmological or anti-cosmological, gives way to the more general figure of the individual to be corrected, who emerges in the play of relations between family and adjacent institutions such as that of the school, parish, church, etc. Here, in the individual to be corrected, we find the suggestion that the power of normalization is, strictly speaking, a power of correction or rectification. And that the movement from a power that is ritualized, intermittent, to one that can be continually deployed comes from the way that the family is reorganized and becomes incorporated into the project of correction and rectification. In the final movement in the text, the figure of the masturbating child or adolescent emerges as offering the universal potential for correction, while the monster and the person to be corrected are absorbed into the figure. This transition is accomplished through a detour, a very important detour into Christian procedures of confession and penitence, through which the body and flesh are separated. In the interpretation of the sixth commandment, masturbation is added to other ideas of the flesh as techniques of questioning in confession undergo subtle changes. Thus, what makes the subject open to these new psychiatric discourses seems to have been made possible by the techniques of Christian confession and penitence. What is to be corrected is not any more a crime or even an illness, but the entire field of child sexuality. The genealogical line followed here is that which starts with sins of the flesh, which then produce a meshing together in the 18th century of psychiatry and family, rather than psychiatry and the judicial, or so it seems at the first reading. We shall see that this is actually not a correct reading. This meshing together is generated by the figure of the adolescent masturbator, who makes the person to be corrected present everywhere and also opens the family for medical intervention, generating the medicalized family. As the emphasis shifts from the masturbating child to the desirous adult, we see that the manner in which the generalization of instinct and new kinds of power of psychiatry come to be integrated within the family. By the end of the 19th century, pathology has been distinguished from the abnormal, as deviant behaviors become syndromes rather than illnesses, and a new nosography in which uncorrected sexual instinct can generate every kind of disease comes into being. Psychiatry in this picture then becomes the custodian of the social order. Three questions put to psychiatry even today by the courts, Foucault argues: is the individual dangerous? Is the accused indictable? Is the accused curable? Have no meaning, strictly speaking, in law or in psychiatry that deals with illness. These questions are the residues of the theory of the generate. They belong, for Foucault, to the psychiatry of the abnormal. But what picture of power does this leave us with? I will pose three specific issues for the discussion in what follows, and then give a brief ethnographic vignette to suggest some other directions that happen in the gaps between sovereign power, regulatory power, and the power of normalization. The three issues I pose are: one, on the norm; second, on the grotesque; and third, on the subject. In his lecture of 15th January, Foucault cites Canjulesham's book, The Normal and the Pathological, for the ideas he considers historically and methodologically fruitful. First, he draws attention to the general process of normalization in the 18th century and the multiplication of its effects. Second, he cites, within quote, the important idea that the norm is not defined as a natural law, but rather by the exacting and coercive role it can perform in the domains in which it is applied. The point Foucault emphasizes in Canjulesham is the element of the norm on which a certain exercise of power is founded and legitimized. Quote, Canjulesham calls it a polemical concept, perhaps we could call it a political concept. And I'm going to argue that this is a very strange statement, because for Canjulesham, the polemical is absolutely central, precisely because you can have a contrast between the two poles of the normatively normal and the pathologically normal. So simply by a statement to make something like a polemical concept into a political concept seems to me to have been put there without really much. It's part of Foucault's project, but it was not part of Cangelham's project, and we shall see why. So it's interesting to see which aspects of Cangelham's discussion are elided and what consequences there might be in the different trajectories that the discussion of norm takes in these two authors. I add as a pointer that the discussion shifts in thinking of normalization through security apparatus when Foucault becomes more attuned to the distribution of normalities. Cangelham famously stated the norm does not exist with reference to health. It is pathology, he said, that renders possible physiology and medicine. It also defines life as a dynamic for a life unmarked by any disease would be abnormal. There are two directions then one could take these. I might just read a very important place in Cangelham where when he's talking about the milieu, he's actually arguing that disease is not a particular dimension of health, that it's actually a different entity altogether. And I think that has some really very important consequences for thinking about the difference between Foucault and Cangelham. So there are two directions that one could take these observations toward. The first is what makes knowledge possible, and the second is how does a living body relate to this absent norm. In Cangelham's words, if health is life lived in the silence of the organs, then strictly speaking, there is no signs of health. Health is organic innocence. It must be lost like all innocence so that knowledge may become possible. Thus, the historicity of scientific discourse must begin with the infractions. Only through error can nature be known. On the epistemic level, I see a rapport between Cangelham and Foucault. As an aside, I wonder how the shift in biology from the level of the organ to that of cellular and molecular levels, and the demonstration that it is not only distressed cells but also healthy cells that send out signals, or that extracellular microRNAs that were earlier thought to be useless might play a role in recovery after specific adverse events might change the picture of the norm. At the second level, though, Cangelham is concerned with the way that the individual not only incorporates norms but also generates new norms. Disease, he says, is an experiment with life, leading him to think of the polarity in life, the two kinds of original modes of life, the normatively normal, in which the normal constantly may be transcended, and the pathologically normal, in which the death of normativity itself is coded. Thus, while Cangelham expresses the gap between the norm and the multiple actualizations in terms of negatives, failure, monster, negative value, error, mistake, he clearly sees that the new norms are generated by disease, as Goldstein's clinical observations on patients with head wounds who settle for more restricted environment exemplified for him. Thus, while both Foucault and Cangelham go together some of the way, for Cangelham disease is a debate with the milieu, and in that sense the process of normalization must generate not resistance but a different debate with the milieu. I come to the second point on the grotesque. How does the expert opinion offered in court become authoritative? At several points, Foucault calls the psychiatric testimony a switch point. It is through this switch point that a new economy of crime and punishment is instituted. In the cases that come before the courts, where proof is arithmetic, the psychiatric testimony is asked to basically determine the sanity of the accused at the time that the crime was committed. In modern law, psychiatric testimony creates a link between the criminal act and the life of the criminal, since the court cannot determine culpability. What makes the law silent? For the law, the monster appears the juridico-biological domain in that he combines the impossible and the forbidden. Quote, it could be said that monster's power and its capacity to create anxiety are due to the fact that it violates the law while leaving it with nothing to say. And I think this is a very important point where these switch points always appear. Where is it that the law actually has nothing to say? It provokes either violence or medical care or pity. The limit case for the psychiatrist, on the other hand, as for the lawyers, is the crime without motive, as presented in the case of Henrietta Cornell, who figures in a big way, whose act of killing a neighbor's daughter seems to have no motive. In earlier cases, Foucault showed that the psychiatric testimony essentially, what it does is to create the crime by doubling it in scaled-down version, so that puerile scenes from childhood are evoked as evidence of later criminality. Later, this gives way to creating a rift between the moment of the crime and the earlier life, so that the crime may be seen analogous to possession and later instinct as a force that runs through the individual suddenly and without specific causes. Here is where the critical role of the grotesque surfaces and becomes the transfer point between medical and juridical discourse. The three attributes of the grotesque Foucault defines are A, it can kill, B, it is taken for the truth, and C, it produces laughter. For Foucault, the laughter undermines the other two. It undermines the authority of arbitrary sovereignty, and it ridicules the truth claim of science, showing that these puerile scenes, the childish discourse, do not conform to its own rules. Are there similarities in the way that the grotesque realism functions in Foucault and Bakhtin? For Bakhtin, the carnival releases the grotesque in the form of creation of another body that transcends the given body, creates ambivalent universal laughter that combines the comic and the tragic, and thus threatens the social body. Foucault, however, never tells us in whom this laughter produced. So you'll often all get this thing saying it is laughable, or that this is something that can only provoke laughter. But who is the one who is actually laughing is not very clear in the text. Yet the text makes clear that the farcical discourse is an expression of the inevitability of power that can function even at the hands of effectively discredited. I mean, you can think of all the tin dictators in a certain sense, that a certain kind of grotesque of sovereignty seems to be, does not come in the way of the exercise of power. So at the heart of mechanism in which judicial power, this is Foucault, solemnly clears a space for medical knowledge, it is Ubu who appears, and who, while both alarmed and ignorant, now enables the double mechanism to function. Buffoonery and the function of the expert are one and the same. It is the functionary that the expert is really a clown. It is interesting that the general laughter of the Rabelaisian grotesque is a liminal freedom from the restraint of subject positions across the field. Whereas for Foucault's Ubu, the power of grotesque sovereignty is related to the maximization of the effects of the disqualification of he who wields that power. That is to say, it is specifically around the discourse of truth, the expert's account, the testimony, as qualified that the grotesque emerges as outside and yet inherent in power itself. If we are to then think of power as normalization that resides in disciplinary techniques, it is not the majesty of epistemic truths at the center of the discipline, but the prominence that the marginal acquires that explains their effectiveness. We can see the ambiguity surrounding the psychiatric evidence in courts even today in mainline medical journals on such issues as the ethics of the use of such use of disciplinary powers. Yet it is in the relation between the court, the confession, and family that psychiatry finds the concept of instinct that will allow the link to be made between the motiveless crime, the subject who does not so much invest in the norm as becomes penetrated by it as the discourse passes through him or her life like a bolt, and the puerile childish discourse, the figure of authority, causes to be released as truth. As an aside, which I'm not going to read, but it's very interesting to me that after 1836 and the cholera epidemic, clearly there is a huge amount of legislative power which is being used to pass all kinds of acts, such as the Public Health Act. There are all of these meetings which are taking place in Paris on sanitary commissions, the questions really about how the households of the working classes should be organized, the whole theories of miasma and hygiene. And it's very interesting that in thinking about psychiatric power, Foucault is not actually relating these two with each other. And yet it seems to me that if medical power is the issue, then there are these two sides of it which might have been very interesting to read together. I mean, for me it's very interesting that all these Epidemics Act, Contagious Diseases Act, Cantonment Act, Compulsory Vaccination Act, etc., in India, which were passed, for example, had huge amounts of discussions. Like Compulsory Vaccination Act was discussed for 80 years. And yet, when the British left, only 3% of the population was vaccinated. So there is an enormous profundity of discourse, which is in a certain sense laughable in relationship to the actual power of exercise. I can speak more on that if you like, but the recent work by anthropologists such as Nancy Hunt, which tried to show that that there is a sense in which, along with the biopower, there is also the nervous state, which in many ways is creating, this constant discursive kinds of formations, which in fact have very little, which sit with the biopower in very different times of place. So the subject, or in whose consciousness does the disease infraction arise? Both for Cangelham and Foucault, the subject is not a phenomenological subject, we all know that, but one created through specific modes of subjectivation that have historical specificity. The procedures through which we are invited or incited to become a subject are embedded in the knowledge power axis. Yet for Cangelham, it is the experience of the patient and not simply deviation from the norm measured through laboratory procedures that give rise to medical knowledge. One might say that the founding moment for medical knowledge for Cangelham is the suffering consciousness of the patient. The creation of new norms lies in the cusp of vital and social norms, and it is the living subject that generates new norms, though these are inferior norms effective only in more restrictive environments. He has a wonderful quotation where he says that it's not that the diseased person has failed to achieve the norm. It is that he has adhered to the earlier norm, which constitutes the failure. That it's the generation of the new norm which in fact becomes the success. So though these are inferior norm effective only in more restrictive environments, medical knowledge and the normativity of life are generated together. The norms being actualized have a double character in what becomes sayable and what is normalized. Despite the impression sometimes created in Cangelham that individual norms are generated through the decisions of a sovereign subject, in fact it is in relation to the milieu, he is to say in debate with it, and in variations in the individual life course that new norms are generated. The individual is the site for the play between disease and life. For Foucault, however, the investment in the norm occurs in the model of force. It seems like the norm passes through the individual. At least in the abnormal, newness is tracked more at the level of public institutions, and the switches between judicial and medical discourse and the relation between the techniques of confession and techniques of psychiatry than the experimentation between the individual and her disease. Unlike Cangelham's individual, Foucault's individual is standing before the court as the accused, or she is the confessional, or he is in the confessional, or caught in sexual infringements and handed over for psychiatric evaluation by the family of the village. As the case of the accused Joy, a man marginal to the village who was caught after the sexual violation of a little girl, the infringement arises in the consciousness of the family. And once it reaches the public prosecutor, the accusation becomes one of disturbance of public decency. It is not the suffering individual who demands or seeks psychiatric care, rather the individual is made into the accused in the process of becoming a psychiatric object of action. In Joy's case, quote, it seems moreover that the village itself had taken responsibility for the affair and had transferred it to a completely different level from that of the slaps expected of the young girl. The mayor was gripped by the case, etc., etc. And so, the mayor is gripped by it, there's public prosecutor. Further, after the report of the psychiatric experts, the entire population of Woodcourt, the name of the village, keenly desired that little Sophie Adams, the girl, to be confined in a house of correction. As an aside, I have to say that one of the surprising things about this case is the fact that Foucault assumes that somewhere the subjectivity of the little girl is quite transparent. So the fact that she actually takes the money and goes to buy roasted almonds seems to him very closely, and we know that in History of Sexuality he actually drops the idea that she was raped. That doesn't figure anymore. Whereas here he's saying she was raped or she was nearly raped. But the assumption is that it's the psychiatric discourse which makes this into a problem, rather than anything also that arises in the consciousness of the girl. Now, I'm not saying that there would be a given way in which a little girl would relate to rape, but but having done a lot of work in some ways with children or with young people who are not subjected to psychiatric discourses in the way in which they occur in Foucault, I think this is a very, very complex kind of question. And the fact that he feels that he can read these kind of subjectivities transparently is actually a very difficult question for me. So I've tried to show the logical movement in a text, but a compelling question remains for me. There are different rhetorical devices through which a series of connections are made between the judicial, the medical, and the confessional. Foucault talks of the switch, the stitching, the meeting, the double qualification, doubling, mirroring, resemblance, and analogy. In a longer reflection, I would like to see if the archaeologist is still casting a shadow on the genealogist, and if in the later text, the temptation of archaeology is what Foucault might overcome. At the end of the book, one revisits it to ask exactly what is the kind of power, that normalizing power that we started by announcing that this is the third kind of power that we will be showing. And here we can actually look at these various relationships between psychiatry and the judicial, psychiatry and family, psychiatry and the confessional, and psychiatry and the political. And in each case, when one reads it, it seems to me that what's happening over here is that psychiatry becomes the kind of domain within which that which cannot be addressed, or that which becomes too troublesome to be addressed within these domains, falls into the domain of psychiatry. So, for example, in the case of the judicial case, there is an impasse about the crime without motive, and psychiatry steps in to provide its expert knowledge on how that, by a doubling, that might be addressed. In the case of the confessional, it's very interesting that possession, Foucault says, is something which becomes too troublesome for the church, because, both because of the fact that this is a resistance that is produced to the techniques of confession, and so it's very happy to let psychiatry take it over and medicalize it. In the case of the family, I think it's interesting that psychiatry, one of the things that psychiatry does is to distinguish between the children who need to be removed from the family. And this happens, primarily through the discovery of adult sexuality, not the masturbating child. But the adult who might desire the child, and therefore the whole professions of social work and so on, which come in to remove the child. And the other is, of course, the organization of domestic space, the fact that, the sexes will be segregated, there will be 3 bedrooms rather than everyone sleeping on the same bed, and so on and so forth. But in all of these cases, it seems to me that very interestingly, psychiatry, one, the function that it performs is to provide the grounds for incarceration and removal, which tends to continue to be very important. And the second, which is very interesting, especially in the case of the political, is the fact that psychiatry is called in to pronounce on what are good revolutions and what are simply bad disturbances. And if you then look at the colonies, for example, of course, it was one of the major techniques to say that in the colonies you could not have politics. What you had were riots, what you had were these, madness, which tended to be expressed in what, let's say, the Indians might read as political action, but what is being read as certain kinds of madness not through a psychiatric discourse, but just through the movement of these kinds of languages. So I think we're left with a very interesting question, which is, one, whether the normalization is actually geared much more to the making of the expert knowledge, and that comes out again and again in the fact that this doubling that happens, for example, psychiatry produces the same kind of nosography which would make it recognizable as medical knowledge rather than just public hygiene, or that fact that it develops things like clinical case files, or the fact that it it finds a new language of symptomatology through the route of possession and and confession. But this is reorganized to make it look like medical knowledge rather than pure hygiene. So then it remains these two, but I think for me, one of the very interesting questions is how psychiatry absorbs, in a certain sense, from other institutions what these other institutions find very hard to normalize within themselves. So the last point I want to do is to, the other very interesting question is how it's much more interested, for example, in the questions about confession. The great anxiety is around what this kind of language and hearing so much about lust will do to the confessor, not necessarily to the confessed, which means that it's again the making of the expert, which is really at the heart of some of the theories as these move over here. And finally, I just want to give you one ethnographic vignette from my book on, sorry for advertising it, but from Affliction, which is about this boy who's intermittently diagnosed with sometimes with psychosis, sometimes with mania. And I worked with him for over 5 years. And the point I want to make is that when you look at something like a case, so the case in Foucault's rendering, which is an example of something like a norm or something through which the norm appears, is constructed in a certain kind of way in which the person on whom power is being exercised does tend to disappear. Right? And here I want to give you one example where in the gaps, for example, the fact that in places like India, the medical institutions might be repressive, but they cannot be continuously exercising power because they just do not have the resources to be continuously exercising power. So the example that I gave was of this young boy who, for a short period, because he had threatened to kill his mother, and this had really become very, very hard to manage by the neighborhood, the family had agreed to have him admitted to a mental institution. This is after the reforms of these psychiatric institutions in India, so patients were not being tied up or being given electric shocks. He improves a lot over here, and then there is a very interesting letter that he wrote, which I want to be able to read to you. So the letter that he wrote when he was feeling better, excerpts from this letter, which is in Hindi: deservedly worshipped Mummy and Papa. This is just a salutation. I mean, don't read as some psychiatric symptom and purely something that everybody uses. I want to say this to you. Now I have no complaint against Mummy, Guria, and Nitin. Now I love you all very much. I pray that Mummy and Papa must come here to visit. If they come, I will be encouraged. By their not coming, I will be broken. To Mummy, forgiveness from me. I want to stand defeated by her. I also pray to Guria that she should forget my beatings and forgive her brother. I commented on this fragment in the narrative in my book thus. I don't draw attention to this letter to say that finally the tensions were resolved, but to point out the ambiguous way in which Swapan gestures towards the crime of the mother as being both the one from whom he seeks forgiveness and the one he forgives. The juxtaposition of the sentences, forgiveness from me, as well as I stand defeated, point not to a resolution but to an uncertain future. My description moves towards the end of the story as follows. Towards the end of the month after his discharge from the hospital, Swayam had an adverse reaction to the drugs he was given, and his tongue started swelling and hanging up. He was taken to a local practitioner and administered an injection. Swapn got better, but now decided on his own to take only one medicine among the prescribed ones. When I learned this, I told him that we must talk to the psychiatrist at the OPD. Simi was with him at the OPD the next time, and she asked the attending psychiatrist as to why Swapn was not getting psychotherapy. His discharge note had said that he was receiving counseling. The attending psychiatrist looked at the file and said, but this is the wrong file. Another file was summoned, someone was taken to another psychiatrist, another set of medicines was prescribed. I was truly dejected, as I thought they do not tie up patients and beat them anymore, but with 3 minutes per patient in the crowded OPD, mistakes will happen. Swapn, Rajan, Simi and I planned to see how he might be enrolled in open school and pass his 10th grade. On my last visit to his house that winter, Swapn said to me, Auntie, do you have a PhD? I replied yes and was intrigued. He said, switching to English, you must be good in studies. I had never spoken to Swapn in English, never assumed that he would speak English. I had known him for close to 5 years. So I said, Swapn, you're speaking in English. He replied proudly, yes, in the hospital I met a professor like you. He told me that my English is good, and in the hospital I was speaking in English, and it helped me. Then after some reflection he added, perhaps now my career will be made. What the ethnographic voice might correct or complement from the archival record is the gaps that are revealed in the project of normalization. Not all institutions line up against each other neatly, and cases which never get to the courts reveal gaps through which new norms at the level of the individual or the family might be generated. If Swapn had killed his mother, which he repeatedly threatened to do, the discourse of the moral monster might have been activated in court. But several factors that emerge contingently and intermittently from actions of neighbors, kin, even the public, prevented this eventuality. We can see that in inserting his desire for English and for modernity in the hospital setting, he created a series of doubles. First, the doubling of his mother as the tormentor and the victim, and then in the figure of the professor, doubling the math professor and the anthropologist, is a world out of reach that could be still intermittently touched. So the point that I want to conclude with is to say that there are obviously certain kinds of questions as to what a case might be, and that in that sense, bringing in things which are in fact not in the archival record, in fact opens up the question of what kinds of gaps between these knowledges are there, but also how subjectivation, in fact, often exceeds that through which subjects are in fact.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just
It is as a historian that I would like to offer today a few remarks on the 1974, 1975. Is that okay? Is that good?
It's not too strong.
It is as an historian.
Apparently.
It's the thing is that I don't want to go too close because then it's like horrible. Okay, is that a good distance now? So I wanted to say that I'm going to intervene tonight as a historian. And not at all as a specialist of Foucault, and not even as a intellectual historian of the 1970s in France. But as I am writing right now a book on disciplinary regimes in the French Empire, and especially through the Code de l'Indigénat in 19th century Algeria, I find the cycle of lectures from penal theories and institutions, 1971-1972, to Il faut défendre la société in 75-76, incredibly useful. And I'd like to maybe a little, go a little deeper in this idea of useful, of the usability of Foucault. I won't get too, I won't really mention my own research. What I wanted to say that before getting to what one can do with Foucault, we need to read him, or to read those texts carefully, which is what I'm going to try to do tonight. I'm going to stay very close to the text and maybe say what are the difficulties that I encounter, the obstacles over which I stumble. Is there a problem with the sound, or is this okay? In the back there?
Okay, just
It's a huge relief.
Yeah? Is that okay in the back? Yes? Good. Okay. And which I think are, in a way, necessary preliminary steps to work with those texts. So, why is it useful? As you know, the history of colonization and its violence still so palpable in France at the time when Foucault writes, when he writes about, when he's at the Jeep, the prison of Toul is directed by someone who was also the director of the prison of Algiers during the war. And that's something that Foucault doesn't mention in his work. It's through the apparatus, historical apparatus around his work that one can see that. So the history of colonization and its violence is not present at all in Foucault's text. Of course, in that regard, Anne Stoller's work has been essential for us, I think, to both in her pointing very lucidly to this blind spot in Foucault's work, and also to the possibility that his work offers to be read in a different way, to be appropriated by us in order to produce colonial genealogies of power. So that work, I think, is still remains is indispensable. But I would say here that the violence, specifically the violence of modern French colonialism, might even appear incompatible with what Foucault tells us about the history of penal regimes, and beyond is skepticism toward the category of violence, too easily imposing itself, I think, as a universal. And you might recall the lecture for 2 weeks ago, of the first lecture in psychiatric power, where he was, explaining all the notion that he was unpacking several notions he was unhappy with. One of them was violence, and he said that, again, so this is page 14 of Psychiatric Power. You may not carry around Psychiatric Power to read this. Then again, violence does not seem to me to be a very satisfactory notion, because it allows one to think that the physical exercise of an unbalanced force is not part of a rational, calculated, and controlled game of the exercise of power. So I know that tonight we are not going to speak about contemporary regimes of violence. I'd like to point out that this sentence, this phrase here, might be a good point to start. I'm well aware that Foucault did not want readers, but users. He spoke about utilisateurs, very concrete word in French. And that the proverbial toolbox he had in mind was made of weapons to be seized by people to lead very concrete struggles, not to do historical research. But if we leave this question aside for a while, the question of the use of Foucault's concept, to the reader of Les Anormaux, actually to this reader, the appropriation of some key notions, tactical or not, is in no way obvious. Despite the limpid style, the pedagogical tone, the meticulous unpacking of examples, and the exposition of analysis, which remain very synthetic in the books associated with the lecture. So in Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, you have very synthetic presentation of examples like the Charles Jouy case, which are exposed at length in those lectures. Despite all this text presents several difficulties, at least to me, in the forms of tensions in how Foucault develops his concept of power, and that those are those tensions, those difficulties I'd like to present to you tonight. Maybe you can help me, get over it. So, first difficulty, or first question. The historic demonstration of the pathologization of masturbation, so central to Foucault's genealogy of normative power, is, if I may say so, a little anticlimactic. In the lectures of March 5th, He pursues a critique of the repressive hypothesis, which I had already formulated in previous years. At this point, he is aiming at its formulation in the recently published book of a certain Von Hussel, Histoire de la répression sexuelle. According to Foucault, Van Hussel, inspired by Marcuse, affirmed that the repression of masturbation is a result, I quote, of the development of capitalist society, in which the body ceases to be an organ of pleasure in order to become an instrument of performance. Foucault considers this a too general explanation, which, among other things, cannot account for masturbation in particular. It might have worked for sexuality in general, but why masturbation? Yet, and that's one of the problems for me, in the end, he offers an apparently similar analysis when he explains that the pathologization of masturbation by, I quote, here I quote page 255, I'm going to quote several passages from Abnormal, so long quote from 255. He explains so this pathologization by a political and economic interest in the child's survival. The state demands from parents, and the new forms of relations or relations of production require that the costs entailed by the very existence of the family, by the parents and the recently born children, are not squandered by the early death of children. And by the way, it sounds so much better in French. I must say. Okay. At this point, and I think that's important, biopower, even if the word is not used in the lectures here, or at least in that year, unless I missed something, biopower seems barely distinguishable from old capitalist power, especially as it also produces what strangely resembles what one could call ideological effects. To quote again, in that's the same lecture at the end of toward the end of the lectures, of the cycle of lectures, to quote again, the constitution of the cellular family around the control of the child's sexuality was a trick, a trap into which the parents fell. They were given in the end, and that's page 258, a fictional power. What is a fictional power in Foucault? For sure, this fictional power is said to have enabled the real constitution of the space of the family. But still, the reader of Foucault is unsettled by the idea that power could be in any way fictional, as if again there was a power, there were more real forms of power, especially when associated with the family. Second difficulty. What does Foucault, and I think I'm going to go closer to Professor Jack's series of questions, what does Foucault mean exactly when he evokes a grotesque or ubuesque power in the first lecture? When he associates it with, I quote again, page 11, the fact that by virtue of their status, a discourse or an individual can have effects of power that their intrinsic qualities should disqualify them from having. Does this imply that there is a more qualified form of power? Foucault, of course, reassures us. There is no absolute distinction between different forms of power, and the ubuesque kind is only, I quote on page 13, a way of giving a striking form of expression to the unavoidability, the inevitability of power, which can function in its full rigor and at the extreme point of its rationality, even when in the hands of someone who is effectively discredited. And again, here the idea of discredit I found slightly problematic. This, and still, what is this form of power with more credit than others? The question, I think, is rendered more acute by the fact that Foucault proposes a very similar distinction within knowledge when he differentiates between expert psychiatric opinion and psychiatry per se. On page 37, he says, whatever one may think of present-day psychiatric discourse, what expert psychiatric opinion says is, of course, a long way below the epistemological level of psychiatry. What is the epistemological level of psychiatry in 1974, really, for Foucault? There is here, I think, an implicit, and maybe for a beginner's reader of Foucault, disturbing Foucault's, the one was on 101, but he's still looking for Foucault 102. Disturbing hierarchy of epistemological levels, which seems to imply a standard from which one could judge the value of specific forms of knowledge. Another surprise can be found in the way Foucault describes normative power, and I think I'm going to quote something that Professor Das already quoted. When he says that when he speaks about normative power as different from both judiciary and medical powers, when he says, when he presents it on page 42, as he says, normative power does not derive from a power that is either judicial or medical, but from a different type of power, that for the moment I will provisionally call the power of normalization. What is this third kind of power, which surprisingly seems not to be linked to specific institutions, that is neither the judicial nor the medical, and in some ways subsumes the two other more concrete forms of powers? It's difficult here not to see it as a more fundamental and maybe more foundational form of power, which obviously, again, seems not to fit with the complete immanence we associate with Foucault's conception of power. Third series of questions. The saturation of abnormal with the vocabulary and explanatory schemas of mechanics might make the reader pause for a while. Of course, and we are used to it at this point in this series of lectures, Foucault conceives of power as a technique because it implies relations between individuals and groups, and because, and that is, I think, an absolutely essential point to always remind oneself when Foucault, because power is always physical. That was also said very clearly in the first lecture of Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique. Throughout abnormal, power uses technologies, produces effects through mechanisms, which Foucault describes sometimes as cogs, rouage in French. The expert opinion is described as what makes possible an exchange between judicial categories and medical opinions. And that's, for example, on page 33. The French formulation here, when he speaks of exchange in French, is échangeur, which really evokes some kind of electric circuit, where you have some current going from one way to the other. It's also, the expert opinion, on page 41, an infinitely feeble and infinitely solid little peg, holding together a very strange discourse. The spoken rhetoric of Foucault, of course, who tells us again and again that he repeats himself, reinforces the impression that the recourse to mechanics is, in the end, a little mechanistic. Of course, we all know very well that Foucault's project is not to reintroduce a form of necessity in history. And to help us here, he takes the precaution of reminding us that mechanisms and technologies of power have no agency. They are themselves produced in the course of the transformations of relations of power. Yet, one needs to interrogate a little more deeply, I think, the workings of the myriad forms of mechanisms that Foucault is obsessed with, because they introduce into the historical demonstration a degree of rigidity, and in the end, maybe a form of localized and always fragile necessity that I think requires a little further scrutiny. I think here, to understand this kind of tension between, the immanence of power in a way, and this mechanisms, this mechanic, I think it's essential to unpack a little what Foucault meant by dispositif, a notion that was introduced by Deleuze and Guattari in L'Anti-Oedipe in 1972, and which Foucault will reappropriate at this in the mid-70s and define. That's a text that dates from 1978 as I'm quoting Foucault, heterogeneous ensemble of discourses, institutions, architectural constructions, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific, philosophical, moral, philanthropic propositions. The dispositif in itself is the network, so it's not any of this, it's a network that can be established between these elements. So I think it's useful to do this unpacking of dispositive in order to help us with these tensions in 3 steps. First, contingency. One can note that the existence of mechanisms is not incompatible with sheer contingency. Au contraire, the genealogy of the power of normalization places contingency at its core, and it's very much present in the book, even if it's rather discreet in the formulation. The zooming of psychiatry on the body, Foucault shows, is the result of a complex series of meshing together. He speaks about engrenage, and that's in English on page 274, of different phenomena. So this meshing together is related historically to the progressive focusing of the techniques of confessions on masturbations and not sexual relations. Itself, and that's if I follow Foucault well here, itself the utterly contingent result of the fact that confession was first perfected in seminaries, that is, after all, in places in which sexual relations were mostly with oneself. But there is no necessity here in the demo, at least in the way Foucault presents this in this lecture. Completely contingent. In addition, it happens that later, seminaries became the model of the institutions of secondary education. This is on page 191, which allowed for distribution of the techniques of confession to the education of the bourgeoisie and ultimately to the transformation of childhood as the main point of application of psychiatric power. But here, what I found extremely powerful and brilliant in this lecture, at least, is the degree of contingency that Foucault can, in a way, introduce in this. Okay. Second, resistance. The mechanics of power are obviously not incompatible with practices of resistance and the exercise of freedom. On the contrary, resistance is constitutive of the constant adjustment of mechanisms of power. It incessantly responds to, displaces, and transforms power. In Abnormal, the affair of the possessed of Loudun, the possédé de Loudun, in the 1630s, described at length in the February 26th lecture, is another pivotal moment in the demonstration. The possessed body, as you may recall, is seized by the demon, a phenomenon that, quoting Foucault, follows the trajectory of a new technique of confession while also indicating its limits. For Foucault, this affair, this case, and I think the question of case is absolutely essential here to ponder it all about, this case is a point of reversal and a form of resistance to a new wave of Christianization and to the new power of normalization in the 17th century. The church's response to this problem is for the affirmation of a new rule of reserved enunciation. That's page 220. The second tool used by the church constitutes an essential step, I think, in Foucault's historical narrative. It is, I quote page 221, the external transfer, the expulsion of the convulsive. It is at this point that the major and famous transfer of power to medicine begins. So the expulsion of the process from the church to psychiatry is an essential moment in medicine's hygienic control of sexuality and in its appropriation of the domain of the flesh. That's page 223. Ultimately, and obviously this is very important looking back to the series of lecture of the previous year, ultimately this is also how psychiatry was able to construct hysteroepilepsy, that is to say the hysteria. Third, the question of norms. I think that understanding the tension, those zones of frictions within Foucault's lectures might benefit from exploring how much this text owed to a discussion of Georges Canguilhem's work on norms. And obviously, there is some degree of overlap, if not complete agreement on this here. Foucault, as you recall, convokes Canguilhem quickly toward the end of the second lecture on January 15, 1975, when he articulates the theoretical stakes of his program for the year. And he announces that he draws, I'm going to go fast because actually it's been read already twice, he draws three main ideas from Canguilhem. One, there was a general process of social, political, and technical normalization in the 18th century, so he says Canguilhem has a historical thesis. Two, the norm does not function as a natural law, but exercises an exacting and coercive role. And finally, 3, the norm brings a principle of both qualification and correction. So I'd like to, again, examine this a little in a little more depth. So all this was page 4950. So here Foucault quotes, in the text of the lecture, he quotes a 1963 addendum to the normal and the pathological, which is, so it's an expansion of the was a class that Canguilhem gave at the Sorbonne in 1963, and there was an expansion of the work that he'd done previously in 1943 and was published at the first edition of the normal and the pathological. So in 1963, Canguilhem wants to extend his initial analysis, which was written exclusively in reference to biological sciences, and more specifically to medicine. So he wants to expand it, I quote, Canguilhem here, to the concepts of norm and normal in the social sciences, sociology, ethnology, economics. So going from biology to all these domains. Obviously, we can, integrate this for people who are doing intellectual history. We can see this in the light of the, the triumph of human sciences in the 1960s in France. But I don't think that's the most important point. I think what is important here is that Canguilhem really is trying to work very hard on the question of social norms in their relationship to what he calls the vital norms, les normes vitales. And he notes immediately the difference between social and biological norms. He said that social norms are more highly integrated. And he spends very, very interesting pages, or he describes very interestingly in a few pages, how in our capitalist society, technological normalization is linked extremely deeply, not only to economical norms, but also to juridical norms. So he's interested in this articulation. And I think, I'm going to go maybe a little faster here, I think that to a large extent, the circular effects, the networks of techniques of normalization that Foucault, the cartographer, that Deleuze has taught us to look at, that Foucault, the cartographer, attempts to map, are an echo of this articulation of norms. And the dispositive, to a large extent, also is a tool that Foucault produces in order to describe this articulation of different norms in society. But for Canguilhem, biological and social norms are also similar in important ways. First, they are productive. They are not constituted by an outside force, but they are in themselves constitutive of specific form of life. For Canguilhem, biological norms are not a given of nature, but the result of life, affirming itself against illness and ultimately death. A norm is in a way a reaction. This is why Canguilhem said the abnormal is existentially first. And he said that, interestingly enough, in his lecture on the social and the biological, not only in his kind of philosophy of medicine. He says that life's reaction is also definition and designation of the abnormal, which become the effect, I quote Canguilhem here, the effect of the normative project, the norm exhibited in the fact. So in that sense, the abnormal is logically second. That's on page 149 of the English translation of normal and pathological. This is why, and this is why I think he said that Foucault said the concept of norm was polemical, that there is this kind of complex relationship between being first and being second. Okay. This, I think, has important methodological consequences for Foucault's project. In Canguilhem's work, the force of life manifests itself only through its errors, its failures, when it stumbles over obstacles that limit it. And this is why the knowledge of life, la connaissance de la vie, which is another very important book by Canguilhem, rests on an understanding of the pathological, the abnormal. In that sense, biology is not a knowledge of the laws of life, but of the norms it produces. And I think that explains some of the tension that Professor Dice was underlining. In this process, biology distances itself from mechanics. One understands better, I think, not only the centrality of the abnormal to a genealogy of power, but also the potential tension between the study of norms and the project of a physics or microphysics of power. This is because norms are constantly being produced and are producing effects in the context of the movement of social life. The concept of normalization excludes that of immutability, and it includes the anticipation of a possible flexibility, says Canguilhem. I think that's very important. There is constant movement. Yet, and this is essential, this is an essential point for understanding the insistence on the mechanics of power in Foucault, the integration of different norms in society seems to produce a certain degree of rigidity through institutions. Not everything moves all the time, or not everything moves at a certain time. And I think this issue, the concept of dispositive is really something that's trying to both capture the idea of movements in social life and also the zones of rigidity that are being produced by the integration of norms at a given moment. This is highly abstract. I can see that, but I think that's really essential. In Canguilhem's work, or in Canguilhem's words, who actually is borrowing from Auguste Comte, then, society is both a machine and an organism. And in that sense, society is not completely comparable to a human body. It seems to me that in the genealogy that Foucault wants to do, the notion of dispositive serves the purpose of, I think, I'm going to quote again Foucault in a text known as, in French, as the impossible prison. The notion of dispositive serves the purpose of indicating the solidity and suppleness of mechanism of power as different strategies which are mutually opposed, composed, and superposed so as to produce permanent and solid effects. Actually, this text was translated in the governmentality effect under the English title Questions of Method. In the end, I'm going to go very fast. I think that, I'm going to really go super, I'm not going to say what I wanted to say because we don't have enough time. But I think that this realization or this centering of Foucault's thought on the question of norm and normativity is what also makes him, in a way, part with historians, with the social historians in France at the time, and also part with, or discard or get rid of the notion of society. In the cycle of lectures from 71, 72 to Il faut défendre la société, you have this second step, which is la société punitive, the punitive society, where society plays still in a very Marxian frame of analysis. Society still plays a substantive role. It is an agent. It's an agent actually at the end of the first lecture in punitive society. He says, he doesn't say society is an agent, but he says power hides behind society. So it's both something that does, an instance, an entity that produces punishment, and also a screen onto which the social wars are being projected, or a scene on which the social wars are being waged, and a screen behind which power is hiding. And I think by the end, in Il faut défendre la société, there is none of that. Society has completely disappeared as a category of analysis. It's actually a category of discourse. It's a category not of Foucault's discourse, but of generic. It's not Foucault says Il faut défendre la société. It's Foucault's quoting people saying Il faut défendre la société, and la société here is just an object of this normative power or normative discourse, and it's not an instance in itself. I think that has crucial importance for how French historians are going to read Foucault, because Foucault says so in that dialogue called Impossible Prison. He says, I don't care about society. it's not an object that I recognize any longer, and I'm going to dispose of it in some ways. And what I'm still interested in the history of the true-false discourse, the discours vrai-faux / faux in French, and French historians are going to say, okay, fine, we are going to stick to society, and we're going to do social history. We are going to go on with the social history. So I think it's a very important moment for historians to kind of make a decision of siding with Foucault or not, or to do a history of norms or not, or to kind of still keep some kind of solidity to the concept of society. But that's maybe another discussion that might or might not have, but we have very little time left.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, I'm going to try and go as quickly as possible and just raise 2 questions for each of our speakers so that we can have other questions raised and comments. Those were so rich, and they themselves raised so many questions themselves. I think we have a lot of food for thought. Professor Das, so in your fascinating discussion of the ethnographic study of the young protagonist, Swapan, I thought you raised a really interesting question, intriguing question about whether patients as well, patients as subjects, can generate new norms themselves. And how difficult it might be for them to hold on to those norms once generated. Now, you trace this to Canguilhem, and that seems right. You suggest that Canguilhem is concerned with the way that the individual not only incorporates norms, but also generates new norms. And I thought in many ways that brought us back to our conversation at the last seminar regarding psychiatric power, about whether the hysteric patient could serve as a source of resistance to power. So it links the 2 seminars really well, I think. In your last visit with your subject, with Swapan, with your informant, he spoke English, and then that created certain gaps in the project of normalization, and new norms were generated, and he was able to somehow almost create some distance in the project of normalization. Now, in my other conversation with you, Vina, a couple of weeks ago at Johns Hopkins, you had raised the interesting question of whether we could find an alternative to the relationship between power and resistance, if you remember. And the question there was to try to de-link resistance possibly as the immediate counterpoint to power. So my question to you then would be whether we can think, or how we could think, outside of the framework of power resistance in this particular case. Whether it's possible to, and whether it would be fruitful to question whether that your informant is actually creating resistance or something else, or to interpret that through a different lens. Okay? And of course, that was the issue that Linda Zerilli was raising so poignantly with regard to the hysterics. Is it fair to think of the hysteric as the source of resistance? So that would be my question. Now, to Professor Sada, one thought and then one question. On the issue of violence, where you started with, and the concept of violence and the concept of resistance to the concept itself, that also returns us to the discussion in psychiatric power with Alondra Nelson, who was raising a similar issue about the brutal force of violence in the colonial context that had been elided, possibly, by this analysis. And so, well, you could take this as a question or a comment, but another way to interpret it, or to use the resistance to the concept of violence, is the idea that one might be going beyond the central role of violence, not to deny it, but to supplement it. And I fully realize there are all kinds of problems with the notion of supplements and Derridian problems, etc. So I footnote that. But would it be possible to suggest that what we're doing is not suggesting that violence does not operate in society? Lord knows it does. As a death penalty lawyer, I see it operating in solitary confinement, in the police shootings, in the targeted drone assassinations, in the torture and waterboarding, in the events of last week. So surely these are forms of violence, forms of supplice as well. But maybe what Foucault was saying is that those are easy to critique. And he was saying that actually in the birth of politics, in the birth of biopolitics, when he kind of says eugenics, yes, of course this could lead to eugenics, of course human capital could lead to eugenics, but that's too obvious. Let's go somewhere else. The question is, what else is there? What are the other forms of social control that operate? And it's here that I would draw on those notions maybe of discipline, security, normalization, governmentality, etc., that might serve not to displace, but to supplement, or to give us a language or a theoretical way of dealing with the violence of norms, the violence of the norm of marriage, the violence of the norm of heterosexuality, etc. Okay, then the question, quickly. So, Professor Sada, you questioned the mechanisms, and I think that's right. Is it too mechanistic? What is the role for mechanisms in Foucault's analysis, and is it too mechanistic? At the same time, I think that you found the norm analysis fruitful, possibly for your own work, and in the text that you had written, you had suggested that it would help you think through the figure of the indigène, the colonial variation of the abnormal and its declinations, you suggested. And so I'm wondering, how would you escape from the problem of a mechanistic reading in your own work here, in the use of the normalization towards the indigène, for instance? Now, to do that, we could pinpoint two concrete places in the text that we can look at very quickly. The first is around pages 72, 73, when he's dealing with, in the context of the hermaphrodite. Okay? So, in other words, I think there are two places in the text that we could concretely look at to see how the norm is produced, and then what effects it has. The question would be, are these two mechanistic, and how would you avoid that? 72, 73, we have the hermaphrodite. I think Foucault traces here a clear shift from an earlier notion of the hermaphrodite as a mixture of the two sexes, right? Where the problem is the overlapping of two sex organs, or that would be the earlier view, to a later notion of deviance from the norm of heterosexuality. So the hermaphrodite becomes a perversion of a norm or a defective structure. And so he writes on page 72, there is no mixing of the sexes, there are only eccentricities, kinds of imperceptions, errors of nature. Right? And that's a clear space where we see the norm emerge in contrast to an earlier way of thinking about it. Of course, this reminds us very well of Canguilhem, who in that late essay, 63, would write, comme les hommes ne sont pas fous, et comme il n'existe pas de sages, c'est que les normes sociales sont à inventer et non pas à observer. Right? And this would be a clear, though mechanistic perhaps, illustration of that. In terms of the effects, again, is it too mechanistic, or what would be the critique? We can look at the case of monomania. And so here I would point your attention to the pages 116 to 122, and the long development of the Henriette Cornier case on February 5th, 1975. Cornier becomes the monster, the abnormal, because of the inexplicability of her act, because there is no interest, because there is no rationality in her act. And that, it turns out, does a lot of work for the psychiatrist and the jurist, and Vina, you talked about that. It's the creation of the monomaniac, of the abnormal, that resolves this breach, this gap in the criminal law. And specifically in classical penal law, where there is a gap because of the introduction of a motiveless crime, of an irrational subject. Under classical penal theory, as Foucault explains, the criminal subject's reason is the condition of the application of the law. That's on page 116. And so it's in that absent space that we find what he refers to on page 117 as a collapse, a paralysis, a blockage. Right? Psychiatry steps in there to restitute the exercise of punitive power as a form of public hygiene, and it steps in to protect society. ultimately producing this notion of degeneration that will be so helpful to us, or at least, well, that we will explore next week when we turn to Society Must Be Defended. And you get a real sense of that on page 133. In the process, psychiatry constitutes itself as a necessary knowledge, necessary to allow the punitive mechanisms to go on. And I should mention that there's a short digression on page 119 about schizophrenia, which ties beautifully to the work of Jonathan Metzl on the protest psychosis, which you may be familiar with. Foucault asks on page 119, we could ask, he writes, whether the notion of schizophrenia does not play the same role in the 20th century. The discourse on schizophrenia is indeed a way of codifying a social danger as illness. And if you're familiar with Metzl's work, it's in direct conversation with this. He did ethnographic work in Ionia Mental Hospital in Michigan, where he saw it, looking through the archives, and kind of how the patient cards themselves were transformed with prior diagnoses crossed out and then schizophrenia added as a way to deal with the violent black young man in the 1960s. Anyway, here we have a clear example of a norm being created and a clear example of the work that it does. And so the question is, like, how would one avoid a critique of mechanism or mechanistic, and how would you propose to avoid and guard against it in your analysis of the indigène? So those were two quick questions, and I turn it to you to share the rest. Yeah, we still have 20 minutes. I think we are raising very, very important, not quick, or perhaps quick questions that would unleash long answers. Do you want to say something about these questions, perhaps address them, and then we open up to the public? Or does anyone feel very, feel that you want to continue or to say something else?
I'd like to open the
Yes.
floor to the public because it's 8:40 and
Yes.
it's only 20 minutes, and
Okay.
we could speak about this for hours. Which I mean, it's not like I want to dodge a question. I think that those are very important questions, but I mean, this is a seminar now.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I don't.
Yes.
I'm really, but maybe you want to say something.
Jeremy.
This is a theme that has recurred a few times in the course, but I thought Emmanuel's talk really kind of teed it up very, very nicely. And that is a puzzle, which is a dissatisfaction that has recurred over the course of these lectures and that we see really come to a fore in the abnormal, and particularly the reading you offered, Emmanuel, between, on the one hand, a worry that Foucault is ignoring real violence, and that Foucault doesn't tell us enough about freedom and contingency. And on the other hand, a worry that, as you put it, Foucault has reverted to an analysis of old capitalist power. And these two critiques, Foucault doesn't talk enough about violence, contingency, and freedom, and Foucault is too Marxisant, are presented together as if they represent one coherent methodological or political intervention. And to me, they just seem to sort of totally butt heads against one another. Because if one takes seriously just the fact that Foucault, to some extent, is talking about old capitalist power, and one recognizes that these lectures begin and end with Foucault's invocation of the Nazi regime. It is on right on the page where he talks about cogs that you quoted, 12 to 13. He talks about the great modern big Western bureaucracies that come to a head in Nazism and fascism. And then on 316, 317, in the last lecture course, he talks about how Nazism will seize on this genealogy that he has unfurled, the neo-racism of psychiatric power. So Foucault's mechanistic Marxisant account of the development of the state has given us a very clear picture of the brutal, violent, particular apparatus that one would need to resist. And yet there's this dissatisfaction with the diagnosis at the same time that there's this dissatisfaction that he's not talking enough about contingency or freedom. It seems to me he's not talking about contingency or freedom because he's talking about the development of an institution that represses contingency and freedom and does so very successfully.
I think.
And so I wonder, like, it seems to me there's a real tension in your two angles of your critique.
So David Garland and you were going to say something as well, or Luca.
But there's
yes,
so little time, I don't know.
So I have two brief questions, both sort of directed to Professor Sada, but I think of general interest. One is, if I understood properly, you expressed some surprise at a remark by Foucault where he suggested different epistemological levels regarding knowledge that one could, as it were, judge. My understanding had always been that Foucault was rather conventional in, as it were, accepting the existence of the natural sciences having passed a threshold of scientificity, and his focus was on human sciences, pseudosciences that were still grounded in power relations. So I thought he definitely was working with a key distinction. The other question was more about his use of the term dispositive. I have always thought that dispositive, the kind of notion of the assemblage of rules and laws and discourses, knowledges, techniques, powers, was pretty much akin to what Max Weber means when he talks about a historical individual. So Weber talks about, modern rational capitalism is a historical individual that is a composition of integrated elements that are significant to the analyst and operate in some kind of loosely integrated form in a culture and can be analyzed for their historical and cultural significance. So I think that the dispositive in Foucault and the historical individual in Weber are the same, except for the point you made, which was that somehow Foucault abstracts from this assemblage the notion of the linking network that integrates them. Now, that might be right, but I don't see any evidence that Foucault actually ever focuses on the linkage rather than the assemblage. In other words, it might be a difference that he identifies, but never actually uses. I wonder if people who, as it were, have studied the use of dispositive in Foucault have any light to throw on that question.
If I could, yeah. So I think, well, first of all, thank you both for the papers. They're really, really interesting. I think Foucault's notion of dispositive changes quite a lot, right? I mean, it's early, it's much more mechanistic, it's almost has a thing-like quality, and people translate it in that, as a thing-like quality, right? A technique, and then people say technology, but they mean, and then it sort of becomes much more réseau. And it's that réseau that really, really, I think, is the important one. So when you say he doesn't show the linkages, I think he demonstrates it. It's something I want to talk about next week, much more than he ever really says how it actually works. He kind of goes through these very minute strategies in getting to it, but it's always remained somewhat elusive. I thought the issue of, this is something that perplexes me a lot. We're always saying that Foucault tells us that power is not in one place, nobody has it, nobody owns it, it's this. And then we still talk about power and resistance. And I find that absolutely bizarre, because it's almost as if we've just negated the very thing that we've been so excited about that Foucault offers us. Power and resistance are not even categories that that work for him, nor should they work for us. One of the things that he's doing all the time, rather than power and resistance, is look in the nature of, and when you were talking, I thought it was really interesting, Emmanuel, talking about the different kinds of this sort of epistemological level at which things are okay or not okay. He's talking about qualified and disqualified knowledges that are constantly in motion, and that inhere these disqualified ones inside one another. And it's when they resurrect, he uses that language of it. But it's not power or resistance. It's what form they take, how they take over and become qualified, and therefore assume much more sort of presence than they would otherwise. I also thought there was something really important in what you were saying, Emmanuel, that keeps slipping by us, and we kind of give him give Foucault the right to it, is sometimes the analytics gets all mixed in with the discourse he's actually talking about, right? And I find myself sometimes going, well, is this my analytic? Or is this well, we know if we defend de la société what that is. But at the same time, it does all this work for him, even though it's supposed to be that which is kind of the ruse, the rationale for so much else. So I feel like that's a place that keeps coming up in a very kind of subliminal kind of way, that distance between what's the apparatus itself, that and it's an analytic apparatus, but what is being deployed that we're supposed to be analyzing.
Rosalind and Luca, please.
I want to try and link these two comments together. Because it seems to me that the concept of resistance in Foucault is both more psychoanalytic than oppositional, and also simultaneously partakes more of the language of science, of that the resistance of the electric interchange that you described, and that has something to do. That is, it's not a question of agency. It's not a question of oppositional consciousness.
No.
And so it's not a problem to speak of resistance because this is going to be inscribed in the materialities that are produced under certain circumstances. So, I mean, the question would be then, what is it that generates that as the modality of resistance, such that it exists? And I think he stages that for us precisely in the terms you described when, I think it's 51. He says the reason that the old model of power doesn't work is because it is appropriate to slave society, feudal society, caste society, all those forms of society in which, to some certain extent, by birth, one is ascribed to a particular limited domain of possibilities, and that changes under liberalism, supposedly, no longer casteist, as though feudality has been banished and so forth. And to the extent, and that is the domain of the productivity of power, not the repressiveness of power. But it's contingent on some developments, and those developments, which we started talking about last week, via the problematic of the simulacrum, the hysterical, the simulation. In those circumstances where you are not by birth, or by some marked form contained in the domain of possibility, that is, in liberal society, anyone could become anything. Simulation and dissimulation become a very particular problem. And the labor of containing that, it seems to me, takes place not through so much, and I think here we could take some distance through the production of this thing, sexuality, is through the production of the category of woman as the scene at which both the simulation and sexuality get defined. So we have as our case studies, we have the two hermaphroditic women, we have the possession on the bodies of the women, and we have in all of those cases a kind of radical negation of the possibility of that other kind of resistance. That is, it's only going to be the body that is the scene of this non-conformity to norm and so forth. And I mean, it's struck. I don't know what I'm saying.
It was great.
But I think there's something about this seeming split in the analytic and the displacement into sexuality as a problem of gender, which is part of, or is a task for us to understand Foucault in that moment, in that period in the 70s. And I think we were talking about that last time. It's very interesting to come back to, in particular for anthropologists, it's our fetish, to come back to the question of possession in this way. And Decepto is, of course, present there, and a lot of Decepto's analysis is evacuated from this recounting of it in a very interesting way. But I think one gets slightly blocked in that problematic when we kind of fall back, as we inevitably do in this translation, from French to English, into a category of resistance that wants always to be a problem of agency, a problem of freedom, a problem of will. I think this is a way of narrating the foreclosure of that possibility, or narrating the historical processes that mitigate against that, and that leave then a kind of political crisis at the end of Castor's.
Let's take another question from Luca, and then you probably want to give some answers.
So, I mean, we were talking earlier about the question of whether Foucault evacuates contingency, whether he's too mechanistic, whether there's not enough freedom built into his account. At the same time, Professor Sada expressed kind of, I think, dissatisfaction with the way in which Foucault seems to want to immediately suture his analysis in kind of curious ways back into a discussion of the, capitalist relations of production in a way that seems strangely kind of to come back. And obviously, in the course of the seminar, we've talked a lot about this question, Foucault and Marxism, although we sort of let it drop for a few lectures because it wasn't as apparent here. But I think one of the things is that even the question of, Foucault's mechanism, the use of mécanique, apparatus, I mean, we have, I think, here, one of the issues is whether there's not a kind of, I guess, reminiscence or kind of recurrence of kind of Marxist categories that Foucault is really struggling to break with here, and that we can't read, and perhaps we can't read a kind of linear break into, or it has either not yet occurred or always already occurred, but it seems that it's always kind of in process. And earlier we talked in one of the courses about Foucault's functionalism, because again in the La Société Punitive, it's again about the kind of historical production and reproduction of the relations of production. And so one of the questions is whether, Canguilhem here is an important interlocutor for Foucault, but we should also consider whether or not he's really broken with the kind of Marxist kind of categories, whether in fact conceptually he's beyond them, it's still having to resort to some of the language from contemporary Marxist kind of philosophy. And then I guess in there, the question of whether we should read Foucault as a kind of having created or inaugurated a kind of coupure with his contemporaries, or whether we need to read him in process in a kind of theoretical kind of constellation in which he's always kind of embedded and entangled and really can't quite, and perhaps feels no need to completely break free.
So Vina and Manuel, you want to?
I think that was a great question that you asked. And one of the things that I find very puzzling in this book, if I don't look at just large theoretical questions of the actual movement of the argument, is that if I look at Canguilhem, you can see there that individual singularity is very important for him, because in medicine, unless you can apply your knowledge to a case, it's no knowledge, right? In Foucault, very interestingly, the legal case appears again and again and again, and you see Corneille Wright going from beginning to the end. There is nothing equivalent like a medical case that he produces even once. We only have the moment when the administration takes charge of it, the moment when the court takes charge of it. Right? And that's why, in a way, when I look at somebody like Chopin, it seems to me that if I gave you a longer thing, which you can read in the book if you want, what happens at every point is that he changes the stakes. Right? There is a point when he is refusing to go to school. There's a point when he is, when he threatens, beats up his mother. There is a point where he defecates in the house, etc. And I don't think that this is very easy to think about purely in terms of resistance. But really, it seems to me that what is happening over here is a certain kind of constant sense of moving between pathology and anomaly. And that's why Canguilhem is very interesting, to say, what's the nature of pathological normativity? Which then would require us to really consider what kind of normativity, or what kind of normal normativity he is striving towards and failing to find. But in the process, he makes everybody else also completely pathological. There is a point at which his mother says, why doesn't he just die? And then she says, look what he's made his mother. He's made her into a demon that she can wish for her own son's death. Right? And so that's why it seems to me that the questions, when one goes away from, large kind of theoretical notions to the actual movement of the text, it does seem to me that psychiatry becomes basically a receptacle of everything that the others can't solve.
I can't obviously in 3 minutes answer all these fantastically important and interesting questions. I suppose I was not very clear because I think some of these tensions, I mean, I was pointing out the tensions to, you know, someone who's not a specialist of Foucault, and then I was trying to explain that norms does a lot of work for him in resolving those tensions. So maybe I was missing that. So one thing about the issue of violence, yes, okay, it's obviously you always say that it's a supplement. It's all like disciplines and violence work together. Or just, I mean, it's said that in many instances, or law and sovereignty, or law and disciplines work together too. I mean, there is never a substitution. There is always a supplement. And violence may be more obvious. Maybe, but in the end, today when I look at historians working on violence, I find this work extremely poor conceptually, and you know, it may be more obvious at the same time. I find that maybe because it's more obvious, we paid less attention to it, and we haven't built, you know, tools that enable us to analyze it in a I'm not speaking about anthropology, I know very important works on okay. And the thing about the colonial, it's not so much that he doesn't speak about violence, it's that he doesn't speak about the colonial. You know, I mean, you know, this is a problem. It's just like it's a scene that is completely absent from his history. So yes, there is violence in, you know, against the working class in 19th century France, and you know, there is a repression of 1848, revolution. But this is not. It doesn't speak about the. I mean, the colonial is completely separate. In my work, I'm not going to speak too much about my work, but in my work, actually, the Code de l'Indigénat was not a. It was a penal regime. It was a disciplinary regime. It was a set of regulation that was actually trying to organize social interactions between colonizer and colonized, and it was not actually the projection of violence. It was, on the contrary, a way for colonizer to tame their own violence. It was a way of restricting violence, and it ended up being a tool of ordinary violence. So, you know, this is where I think Foucault is not complete, at least to me, not completely full. And on the issue of resistance, so that's something that always fascinated me, is this idea that there is no resistance in Foucault. I still don't get it. I arrived in this country and my students explained to me, oh no resistance in Foucault. Okay, and so let's take the Loudun thing. I mean, what is happening in Loudun? When he gets to the possessed of Loudun, if you look at the text very quickly, I mean, in French he does speak about foyer de résistance. That's one thing, but that's not. I don't want to be literal here. It seems to me that what he says to us here, that power in a way suppresses itself, or there is an excess of power. Power turns against itself. It works so well that those young women become totally hysterical. And they are so normalized in a way that they become. There is too much of a normalization. It turns against. He speaks about point de retournement. Mm-hmm, so exactly. This is a moment when this turn of power against itself, in a way, is in a way resistance, because he doesn't have at all, I think, a Freudian view. I suppose John would be better qualified than me to speak about this, but it seems to me that what he said is it is mechanic. When he speaks about force, I mean, he has mechanic in the sense of a physics.
So many ways.
So yes, of course, he believes in physics. I mean, like, I'm not saying when he speaks about epistemological level, I think it was problematic in terms of the human sciences. Is there a standard in the human sciences? Of course, but it seems to me that all these metaphors are so much. When he speaks about resistance, he really thinks, I mean, and that's also in the subject and power, the lecture on subject and power, it's something that is completely derived from a Newtonian mechanics. You have a force and you have an opposition. It is still there. I mean, power as being a very physical thing that exercises an effect, and then the effect can turn it. I think, I mean, unless I'm mistaken, it's still there. So, sorry.
To continue.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Well, first we should thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much.